Hey, I'm Shane Killian, and
So in his response to me, he is it this one?
No, they are not! They have the research to back them up! You're the one lying!
This is like the average kind of content that he'll produce. It's just like screaming about his libertarian opinions. But he did sit down and produce this like relatively decently produced video which argues that libertarianism follows some first principles. And it's your standard formulation of the A equals A argument, where libertarians argue that the existence of the non-contradiction principle in logic means that you can't violate people's property. So I'll probably put it on like 1.5 times speed, and we'll just wash our way through it. Oh my god, now it's on PragerU. Why have you forced me into this garbage website, Antizer?
They're talking to you. I think they're muted.
Oh, are they? Nope. Or maybe they're talking to their kid, or they're not their kid. They're like their brother or whatever.
Right.
Just a bit sure.
Sure.
Okay.
Here's the thing about logic. It's completely objective. There's no my logic or your logic. There's just logic. So if you have a logical position, then it's an objective argument that stems from first principles. First principles are foundational propositions and axioms that do not have to be defended. As long as your argument is purely from first principles, meaning that it's linked back to these first principles with no breaks in the chain and no fallacious reasoning, then you don't actually need empirical evidence to support it, because then the only way for the conclusion to be wrong would be for these first principles to be wrong as well. The first principle we'll look at.
All right, so what he's summarizing here is, I don't think he knows it, it's called foundationalism. The idea that you start with like a set of axioms, and then you can derive everything else from those axioms. And so this is a fine epistemology. If you like want to talk about, it's like the Munchausen trilemma. Basically, any epistemology has to follow one of three forms, which is either an infinite regress, where every belief you have is supported by another belief, another belief, another belief, another belief, and it just never ends. So that's an infinite regress. A circularity, where you have like belief 1, which supports belief 2, which supports belief 3, which actually supports belief 1, and then you think that that's a valid way of justifying your epistemology. Or 3, you have foundationalism, where you just assert that certain things are true. So like belief 1 is supported by belief 2, and belief 2 just is true. You can't question it. Now, you don't need to accept foundationalism, like the idea that he's presenting here that like you need to accept these axioms as absolutely true does not actually follow. There are many epistemological theories, but in general, even if you were like a coherentist, you would still tend to come to some idea of like foundational logic from which to derive the rest of your beliefs. So it's not actually that invalid of a way to like summarize epistemology. So I basically agree with this one, and I'm the spoilers that I'm going to agree with the first two of his principles and then disagree with the rest. All right, Antizer, you got anything else to add?
No. Would you say that is the axioms in which he's like speaking? Okay, is my voice coming? Okay. You mentioned how there's set axioms where you use logic, right? Would you say that the axioms he's using are valid?
I mean, the basic principle that he might even mention in this video, the basic argument that foundationalists and coherentists use for why you can't abandon certain principles is that if you did abandon them, you'd have to abandon logic. And without logic, you can't know whether your principles are good or bad. So you have to keep them, therefore, to even have a hope of having a good epistemology. That's like a really complicated topic, but that's the long short of it. So I do think, in short, I do think it's pretty reasonable to say what he says, that you do have to assume logic at some level to make any epistemological statements.
But I just feel like a lot of the times throughout the argument that he presents, he like goes like on a weird. He like a lot of the stuff he says is like a bit of a stretch. But,
oh sure, so
just continue with the video now, I guess.
He does, so I think if we play on a bit, he does make a claim about like accepting a particular form of logic, so I'll play the video a bit.
Is a foundational principle of all logic and reason, the principle of non-contradiction. Something cannot be A and not A at the same time. Also, if something is A...
So that's the like meme from which the A equals A libertarian argument comes from. It's literally that like A, if we like write it out, they assert that A equals A because if this were not true, then logic would not be possible because you could have A equals not A. and that would prevent any syllogism forming, which we'll get at. Again, I'll explain syllogisms a little bit later in the video. So he's not entirely wrong, but I will note that like principle of non-contradiction is a choice you can make. You could theoretically choose to set up a logic that does not include it. It's just not too important to this argument. So I'll just keep going.
Then it cannot if A and B are mutually exclusive. It may be possible for something that is A to later turn into B, but once it cannot be A anymore. Directly from this, we get the consistency principle. In logic, consistency means that you don't contain any contradictions. So long as the principle of non-contradiction holds, the consistency principle does as well. While there are proofs of consistency, for purposes of this video, we'll just look at falsifiability. If we can find inconsistency in a posit, then the posit must be rejected. So if A and B are mutually exclusive and a true dichotomy, then falsifying A is all that you have to do to support B, and vice versa. Ironically, the consistency principle itself can be supported in this way. Consider the following claims. Consistency is preferable. Consistency is not preferable.
Wait.
This is a true dichotomy.
He mentioned that there needs to be a true dichotomy, right? How do you determine if something's a true dichotomy?
Well, that's actually the whole failure of the rest of his arguments. So as we'll see, so I know the first bit's a little boring.
Liberal?
Oh my god, hate this. Smooth thick,
He could
go fucking
improve
home.
his editing for this video, I think.
What's that? I'm sorry.
There's like a lot of... He could improve on the editing of his video to explain his point a bit better.
Yeah, I mean, Shane is just not very good at presenting things in general, so I think this is more or less what you'd expect from him. I don't have like good examples to point about that, but when I tried to argue with him, it was just like incoherent nonsense. He has a very hard time forming points, and he ducked out of the debating me, so I'll take it. I'll take the win. Anyway, so I will note that there is no such thing like called the consistency principle, but in general, most epistemologies hold to the view that like the less consistency, the better. And so lots of epistemic principles, such as like non-contradiction. Oh my god, I hate that noise. Like adhering to non-contradictory beliefs and stuff like simplicity are all based, like simplicity is basically Occam's razor for epistemology. You shouldn't believe something unless you have evidence for it. And if two things have equal amounts of evidence, you should choose the simpler one. Again, complicated topic, but a lot of these principles are aimed at the idea of like trying to have less inconsistent beliefs. So I don't disagree with him here. This is like fundamentally decent. Jeremy, go back to fucking CERN. I hate you. These are all pretty reasonable propositions. Oh wait, you did give me Prime money. Yeah, give me those Bezos bucks. Give me those Bezos bucks, everybody. Gimme.
Here's Bezos bucks.
So I'll keep, again, I don't have any major disagreements with 1 and 2. I think 3 is where it starts to go off the rails.
True, but both cannot be. But if we examine these statements, we see that consistency is not preferable is a consistent principle, and therefore self-contradictory. By the principle of non-contradiction, we therefore reject it and accept consistency as being preferable. It's the consistency principle that leads us to establish burden of proof. The burden of proof is on the active side, not the passive side.
So this is like just a really poor phrasing. In general, we would say that the burden of proof is on whichever party holds the claim. To say that a burden of proof exists for like use of force, which is what he'll do later in this video, is like very different from making a claim. Unless you want to say that like use of force is the same as making a claim, which is de facto what his argument is doing. So I don't, again, as like a moral principle, because now we've moved beyond logic. His argument that the burden of proof is on the active side doesn't actually follow from either of his two prior principles. Like if he wrote it out as an argument, all that he said is that non-contradiction is good. This doesn't relate to who is the one acting. So I'll just let it play. He doesn't actually prove it. You can hear it yourself.
There are a lot of things you're not doing right now. Maybe you're not collecting stamps at the moment. You're not walking on the moon. You're not inventing the hoverboard. You're not annexing the Sudetenland. There's an infinity of things you're not doing at the time. Imagine if someone said you had to justify every single one of them. There's no way you could do it. It would be inconsistent for someone to insist that you had to justify one or some of the things you're not doing, since you can't possibly justify them all. The only principle consistent with the consistency principle is that if you're not doing something, you don't have to justify it to anybody. The burden of proof is never on the passive side.
So again, like what he said doesn't actually logically follow. The argument that because there are things that you aren't doing and that it would be an impossible burden for you to justify not doing all of them is actually something that like most moral theories solve. Like utilitarianism's argument is that you should do things which maximize utility, and most people have a reasonable, like they have limits to what they can do to maximize utility. So like utilitarian would say most people should probably just live their lives as they can, as best they can, because they are unlikely to like like tomorrow just invent a rocket ship or fly on a hoverboard or whatever. This gets at like the idea of the paradox of calculation, which is that if you were to like try and calculate out the most possible utilitarian outcome, you'd have to calculate forever. You'd have to figure out like, oh, should I do action A or action like A.1 or action A.2? There are too many actions to do. So therefore, it is reasonable to assume under utilitarianism that people should have like a ability to just kind of do nothing and not have too much of a burden imposed upon them. Similarly, the theories of like deontology impose a act-omission distinction. Like deontology will argue that doing something is different than not doing something, and you only need to justify things that you do. So that's very similar.
Yeah, a lot
to
of the deontologists have said stuff like that. That inaction is not like comparable to action. One voluntarist I met online was talking about how there's no such thing as positive rights, which I find like an interesting idea.
Well, I think so.
So
I'm
like
like
the right
a big,
to healthcare is in the thing.
well, I'm a big believer in positive rights, but we can discuss that in a moment. Deontology is very similar to what what's his name? Killian is advocating here, right? It's that like if you ever do an action, you have to justify it, but if you don't do an action, you don't need to justify it. That the basic critique of the act-omission distinction is that by not doing something, you are in fact doing something. You are allowing whatever is currently going on to continue going on. And you can set up like simple logical scenarios which appeal to people's intuitions about this, right? Like if you were standing next to a man drowning and you chose not to do something, you would be allowing him to drown. You would be somehow involved in his death. Now, Shane, of course, would reject this. But as we'll see like later, this doesn't actually work for his arguments anyway. So this is more like an appeal to intuition. It's very hard to prove like which moral theory is correct or not correct. So to be clear, all premise 3 is trying to do is assert a form of the act-omission distinction, which is a moral theory and doesn't actually follow from the principle of non-contradiction. So I guess I'll just keep playing.
Which means that the burden of proof must be on the active side when the active side conflicts with the passive side. In the theism-atheism debate, atheists take the passive side. They see no reason to believe in God, so they decline to. You don't have to defend not believing in God any more than you have to defend not inventing the hoverboard. But since belief...
This is actually a really bad example. So classically, we assert that there are like 3 positions on the existence of God, or really any position. So like for the belief in God, you'd have like atheism, you'd have theism, and then you'd have agnosticism, which would be lack of belief in either side. And so atheism isn't simply like, oh, I'm being passive about the belief in God. That's agnosticism. Atheism would be the rejection of God. Theism would be, I believe in God, and here's the evidence. And atheism would be, I hate this noise. It would be, I believe in God, and I don't believe in God, and here's the evidence. Atheism would be, I don't believe in God, and here's the evidence. So most agnostics, I think, become atheists by Occam's razor. They say, hey, I think there's lack of evidence for God, and the simpler assumption is that God doesn't exist, therefore I'm an atheist. But that's them presenting evidence. So the only like passive side in the theism debate is agnosticism. So he's just wrong in this analogy here. Sorry, I think Antizer was trying to speak.
No. It's just more an agreement on like how it works.
Oh yeah, the presuppositionalists are like worse people. Okay.
I mean, I guess I do speak pretty quickly as well, so I can't really fault him for speaking quickly. That's, yeah.
You don't speak as fast as him.
So the real meat of his argument gets to points 4 and 5. So points 1, 2, and 3 are just trying to argue that like the principle of the principle of non-contradiction leads to a certain moral framework, that you like have an act-omission distinction. If you want a somewhat more interesting critique of the act-omission distinction, it's that, how do I put this? It's that like, what if we simply rephrase any action as not doing all of the other actions? So if you say that like the act of choosing to fire a gun is simply the act of choosing to not do everything else, then the action of firing a gun is actually the act of omission, right? It is the passive side in that one. So defining what is active is generally a very contextual thing.
Liberal.
Oh my God. I hate this noise. Why are people following? Degenerate. Oh my God, why is this Nazi still in my chat?
Wake up, liberal. I love you.
Sweet Dick, how many alts do you have? Stop following me. Okay. So again, it actually doesn't even matter. Even if you believe in an act-omission distinction, his argument,
liberal. I love you.
His argument as it comes to the use of force is just inconsistent on its own rights. So again, I'll just play to get through that.
as atheist is taking the active position, and therefore the burden of proof is on those who claim that God exists. Let me be clear about this. We're talking about the burden of proof. We are not concluding that it is always right and proper to take the passive side. Sometimes the passive side might well be in the wrong. But if you want to claim that the passive side is wrong, the burden of proof is on you to establish that. Everything so far is absolutely consistent with established logic, and you cannot doubt any of this without running afoul of the basic principles of logic and rational thought. They are the...
To be clear, like most philosophers doubt most of what he said. Like philosophy is not like a monolith where everyone agrees with one thing or another. As I recall, in what's it, like the Phil Papers poll? Let me go get that. In the Phil Papers poll, most philosophers were utilitarians. And so they would not agree with the act-omission distinction. Oh, where is it? Yeah, so if you look at the poll of Phil Papers, right, which is a large like philosophy paper hosting website, of their 931 respondents, 25% were deontologists, 23% were consequentialists, and 18% were virtue ethicists. So if Shane Killian is arguing that only deontology aligns with logic, he'd also be arguing that like most professional philosophers in this context are wrong. So it's hard to ever say that like philosophy can only lead to this view. And so I think you should be a lot more careful in asserting beliefs like what Shane Killian is asserting. But of course, like the libertarian argument, A equals A is a common one. He probably just read this in a book and is just parroting it out. So I don't have much faith in him rigorously examining this in its context.
The basis of all science and reason. You cannot reject the principles we've talked about so far without rejecting all of science and reason as well. Now, going from nothing more than these first principles, let's see how this works in the libertarian status debate. Force is active. Ergo, those who want to use force have the burden of proof. Those who do not have no such burden at all. There really is no way around this. If someone's just sitting there not doing anything, the burden is on you to justify any action taken against him, like, say, taking some of his money. And you can't worm your way out of this just by calling yourself a government. That is a blatant violation of the consistency principle. You can't have different rules for government than you do for the rest of us.
So
I mean,
when he said...
you can...
Go ahead.
Oh, yes, sorry.
No, after you.
Like, that's one of the things I don't understand with his argument, is that you can't have different rules for government than you can have for regular people. Regular people still make up the government. Like,
well, so that's where the argument clearly starts to fall apart. So in the beginning, you asked, how would you know... Oh, you like had a phrasing of it, but basically the question was, how would you know, in this context, how would you know if one use of force is analogous to another use of force, if these two things are identical? Because if they aren't identical, then it's not inconsistent to apply different standards to them. Like the basic idea, the classic utilitarian examples would be shooting to kill a murderer is very different than shooting to kill an innocent. The classic utilitarian argument is it is right to kill a murderer to save one life because you are killing one life and you are taking one life, so it's a net neutral. But if you shoot to kill an innocent, you are merely taking one life and it's a net bad. So like the basic idea that like all uses of force are identical, which is what is required for this argument to work, which I'll show in a moment. I have like the syllogisms written out. It is just absurd. It would require you to believe that every use of force is literally identical. And I don't mean that in the sense like every use of force is good or bad. It means that every use of force is literally identical. Like killing a baby is the same as killing 1 million people and so on. All right, I'll just continue. I'll respond to it more when we get to 5.
If everyone affected by the action agrees to it, the burden of proof is on you if you want to interfere. So if one person hires another, and that person agrees to work for wages of $7 an hour, and you think that's too low, that it should be $10 or $15 an hour, the burden of proof is on you to justify your intrusion into this voluntary, private, peaceful exchange. So I know you statists are now chomping at the bit, getting your arguments all ready to justify the forceful actions your government does. But hold on, because initiation of force cannot be defended.
I actually love the way that he says this. Like... I just love the idea that it can't be defended. Like, obviously people have defended. You can say that they failed, but I don't know.
Person A hires person B at $7 an hour. Person C, thinking person B should be paid at least $10 an hour, wants to point a gun at person A and make him pay person B more money. Is he justified in this? Think about it. What if person A then wants to point a gun back at person C because he doesn't want to be forced to do something he doesn't want to do?
So to be clear, the analogy he's making here is that the imposition of a minimum wage, which here he says as person C forcing two individuals to like hire an employee at a certain wage, is equivalent to use of force, which I think is reasonable. Oh my God, I hate that noise. And so I do think it's reasonable to say that like state imposition does involve the use of force, not directly, but like it's like a threat of use of force if you don't follow the rules. So I do think he's correct about that. But again, his argument doesn't follow. So I'll let him finish and then I'll respond to it a little bit more formally.
Person C going to do? person A doesn't get to use force, even though person C is doing what he's doing through force? How does person C have here at that point?
Uh-oh.
It gets worse. Let's say that person D disagrees with person C's interference and points a gun at him. If the initiation of force is defensible, then who is acting in the wrong here? And even worse, after person C makes person A pay person B more money, person E points a gun at person C and makes him do something he thinks he should do, like give up his collection of pornography. How does person C have any logical defense if he wants to complain about it? Under the consistency principle, if one is valid, the other must be too.
That's okay. There's just
Yeah.
there's no nuance to this like analogy.
That's the
thing I
point,
don't
right?
understand about
It is literally the most
very-
unnuanced view. So the consistency principle, it requires that A equals A. And to be clear, what we mean by equals in like philosophy means that they are identical. One way you can conceive of this is like sharing all properties. When you say that apple 1 is identical to apple 2, it means that they share the same color, they share the same shine, they share the same weight, everything about them. In fact, if one apple was equal to another, they would literally be the same apple, because they would also have to share the same position. So like when he says that use of force is equivalent to any other use of force, which is what is required to follow his consistency argument, it literally requires that, again, shooting to kill or murder is exactly the same thing as shooting just randomly and happening to kill someone, as is intentionally shooting to kill people against a firing wall for genocide. These, in his worldview, must be equally reprehensible, basically. So I've written out a little bit of a logical syllogism here, because I did watch the video through at least till this point. And so I discussed this a little bit. Sasha isn't here because they live in Poland. They had to go to sleep. But this is the version that Sasha put forward of how to try and summarize. I hate this noise. Of how to try and summarize the argument that he's raising. So basically, the form of a syllogism looks something like this: P1, X is Y. P2, Y is Z. And then conclusion, X is Z. And so this is like the classic, I don't even remember the name for this. I think it literally might be classical syllogism, but I'm not sure. Basically, you have one premise where you equate one thing to the next, X equals Y. You have a second premise where, again, you equate a second thing to a third. And now, because you know X is Y, because you know Y is Z, we can basically write it out as X equals Y equals Z. And so therefore, X equals Z. That's the format. So if we try and write out what he says into a logical syllogism, it looks a bit like this. 1. Inconsistent application of principles violates the logical principle of non-contradiction, or we can summarize this as X violates Y. 2. Initiation of force in context X and opposing, let me edit this. It should say supporting the initiation of force in context X and opposing the initiation of force in context Y is an inconsistent application of principles. Basically what you're saying here is that Z, that supporting the initiation of force in one context and opposing it in another, is an inconsistent application of principles. That's X. So again, you're proving that supporting something in one context and opposing it in another is an inconsistent application of principles. Finally, then you just equate the two. So you take the first chunk of text and you substitute it into the first bit. So instead of saying inconsistent application of principles violates the logical principle of non-contradiction, you substitute out inconsistent application of principles and you substitute in supporting the initiation of force in context X and opposing the initiation of force in context Y violates the logical principle of non-contradiction. So this is how he arrives at the idea that initiation of force is contradictory and therefore morally wrong. Again, the implication of this is that supporting the initiation of force in one context means you have to support it in every context. Or if you oppose the initiation of force in one context, you have to oppose it in every context. That's the implication of this argument.
What about, in self-defense, say, if someone's running at you with a gun and they haven't really done anything yet apart from running at you with a gun?
I haven't actually watched the full video. I haven't actually watched the full video. Sorry, there's too much latency with fucking Australia. I haven't watched the full video, but I presume what he's going to argue for self-defense is that the self-defender is the passive party. But this is just often not the case, right? It's really hard. In particular, the way that he defined passiveness is like the absence of action. But often passiveness often defending yourself in the modern society requires pursuing legal action against the other person. So you are engaging in force against the other person to reduce their use of force against you, which makes sense under a utilitarian principle, right? You're using force to reduce the use of force. But it makes no sense under this idea of non-contradiction. Under this principle of non-contradiction, again, there's no justifiable force, no context ever. So this is silly. And one of the fun things we can do is we can just change the word force and we can make it other, like funny words. Hee hee. So we could change force to literally fucking, okay? So supporting the initiation of fucking in one context and opposing it in another is an inconsistent application of principles. So if we say that, hey, it is wrong to, like, I don't know, rape a child or something, then by this logic, it is also wrong to have consensual sex with like a 30-year-old and you're also 30 years old. Like, if you apply any verb in this context, it just makes it clear how absurd it is. Now, possibly he's the kind of libertarian where he would be willing to justify, certain actions that we would not, and so he's totally fine with the initiation of fucking, and that's how that he created his own children. But, who are we to speculate?
Your take?
I won't even read. So Sasha, as a bit of a little backstory, I wrote out this much longer, much more complicated version of how I think we would summarize his argument. I won't read it out too much, but I think that you can formalize his argument even more, and it just makes it even more absurd. So that's basically it. It's that once you formalize the argument, it's very, very clear how absurd it is. And in logic, to reject a syllogism means you have to reject one of the premises. So I think very clearly you just reject premise 1. Inconsistent application of principles violates the logical principle of non-contradiction. So when you apply, so inconsistent application of principles is a little bit of unclear wording, but if it were more like inconsistent moral judgment based on the same action, right? Then this very clearly we can say it is fine to be inconsistent about in most moral theories. So deontology, for example, would give you no ability to ever violate, to ever say an action is moral in one instance and wrong in another. Deontology is the moral theory that Shane Killian is arguing for, that force is always bad. But if you apply like a consequentialist framework, then this is just not the case. If you believe that, say, use of force, say to kill a murderer, will actually lead to a reduction of the use of force by saving someone's innocent life, then you are totally justified to engage in an act of murder to prevent an act of murder. So this is just actually a moral claim. What he's saying here doesn't follow from the laws of logic at all. If it did, the deontologists would have long ago won the moral debate. They have not. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm just waiting about my mic stuffing up. Is there amorality in deontology? Also, like actions which are not moral nor amoral?
I think it depends on the deontological theory. I'm pretty sure that in Kant's theory, every action would either be moral or immoral, but I'm pretty sure some deontic theories have like a sense of neutrality. By the way, chat, the reason that I'm like constantly rubbing my elbow is I taped together the arm of my chair because it was falling apart, and some of the tape fell off, and it's been like getting on my arm, and it's sticky and disgusting. Okay, I swear I'm bourgeois. I swear. I'm not a junkie. I'm not. Yeah, I'm sorry, Antizer. Did you have something else to say?
Hello? Okay. It was just mostly about the amorality thing. Because one thing how would this moral theory apply to like amoral actions if they exist, right? Like, because some actions would be like considered amoral, right? Like,
Well, so again, in the theory that he's proposing, which is just that initiation of force is bad, I suppose the non-initiation of force would just be amoral. But you could also say that anything which is like amoral, meaning morally neutral, would also be good by relation. So, like if I say that doing action A has 0 points and then doing action B has -1 points, then I could call action B bad, but I could also call action A good. Like usually we call these relative terms, but that's just the labeling thing.
That's fair. Yeah.
Look, I wish I had like $150 of Soros bucks. I'd buy a new chair.
Is
Let's see,
it
did I even
comfy
have
at
to-
least?
Oh, I love this chair. It's great. But the problem is I'll lean back like this, right? I'll literally lean like this. And while I'm like thinking about something. And so over like 2 years now, I've been like elbowing down like that part of the chair and just destroying it. The other arm is totally fine. Like it has no damage whatsoever. It's all just the left side.
only way consistency principle is that the initiation of force is never justified, which means that the non-initiation of force.
Just to be clear, I want to quote him on that. The initiation force is never justified. That's his words. So this is a version of the NAP which precludes even like self-defense. Unless we'll see if he can find a way out of never justified.
Also known as the non-aggression principle, the basis of all libertarianism, is the only principle compatible with consistent logic. And since this argument was made in an unbroken chain from first principles, you cannot refute it. Your only recourse is to try to find a flaw in my logic up to this point, some link in the chain that was skipped or doesn't work for some reason.
Done. Fucking done. The assumption that like all uses of force are identical is absurd. I think that to be clear, the basic way that you could think about this is, let's say that I said to you every cow was identical. You would reject this. There are obviously different cows. So if I say, hey, all uses of force are identical, and I can apply to you that, hey, there are these two examples of force that you would clearly identify as separate, there is no such thing as use of force as one object. Instead, it is a set of objects. And it is entirely possible to have different preferences over a set of objects. So, like, done. That's the chain broken right there.
That is the only option to you if you want to deny the non-aggression principle. It's now time to turn to the basis for all libertarian political policy: property rights. While non-initiation of force is the guiding principle,
Yes,
property
my
rights.
favorite.
I think my video might be lagging out. Well, I'll let him say his spiel.
Is the logical structure we use to determine who is initiating force and when. This isn't a pragmatic idea. It, too, is based on first principles. We start with the principle of self-ownership. Basically, you own yourself. You own your body, your mind, your time, and the fruits of your labors. Why? Well, what would it mean if you didn't? Who else would own you? If someone else can own you, that would make you their slave. But slavery completely violates the consistency principle. Who gets to own slaves? And who is subject to being enslaved? You would be making different rules for different people.
Wait.
Mm-hmm. You go ahead.
I'm not like, you know, advocating for slavery, but like under certain like logical axioms, you could argue that slavery doesn't, you know.
Well, one of the great ironies, right? The argument that you have self-ownership necessarily asserts, if you genuinely believe in absolute self-ownership, you also have the right to sell yourself into slavery. Now, most people wouldn't do it, but you do have the right to sell yourself into slavery. And this gets into more complicated questions, like of how libertarianism deals with kids, for example. So this idea of self-ownership just doesn't work for kids. So the hypothetical, right? Your kid is running across the street. There's a garbage truck barreling down 60 miles an hour. Do you initiate force and like pull them back? Or because you believe they have self-ownership, do you just let them run along the street? Now, it doesn't need to be a kid in this example. It could be an adult. Most of us, I think, would justify using force to like violate someone's intents and against their will, force them to do something that they would not desire, pull them back and like save their life. But in kids, this is far, far more common. Kids don't understand like the limits of safety. They might like try to fall over a cliff or something. They don't understand what's useful for their like education. Though I'm sure some people will contest that. Generally, studies seem to find that education vastly improves people's intelligence, vastly improves their ability to understand the world around them. So some imposition of structure and fundamentally a restriction of children's freedom actually enables them to have more freedom later in life. This is like the classic lefty argument for positive rights. It's that the violation of your right to property via taxes actually increases your rights in the long run by giving you more ability to achieve your goals by, say, having actually a functioning body, by better healthcare, and actually understanding the world around you via better education, and so on. So, just as you can justify some uses of force, maybe say to reduce use of force, right? Killing a murderer to stop the murder, which is a reduction in the use of force. You can justify the violation of self-ownership or the violation of property rights by taking away someone's money or taking away someone's property and using that to increase other people's freedoms, if what we care about is maximizing freedom and not just minimizing the use of force. So again, this is just a moral theory. At this point, he's well beyond logic.
Really arguing for that. They're more how they view morality is on the actions they do. So I don't think they care too much about the ends.
Well, that's actually, I think I don't know if I put it in the fact sheet yet, but it is statistically true that like the more you go towards the libertarian conservative direction, the more you believe in deontological theories of morality. It's liberals who tend to think utilitarianly, and leftists. Hello?
What's happening?
Yeah, what's up, Method? Why are you here?
Huh? What the hell? How? Why are two of you? Am I lagging?
Probably.
Maybe.
Method, you might have my stream up.
Oh, it's delayed. Okay.
Oh my
So
god.
you can stop you from saying like the N-word or something?
Huh? I'm pretty sure it's just delayed because like that's how light works, right? Like there's 2 points in space and light needs to travel between them.
No, but it was delayed by like almost like a minute or something.
Sure. So Farmlard says it's not the use of force, it's the initiation of force. He's arguing that defensive force is legitimate. So one of the interesting things here, right, is the argument that the initiation of force is different if you're using it in defense versus offense is, I think, very interesting. How would you know which one is defensive? Let's say that one individual mistakenly believes that someone else is like encroaching on their land to steal something. Are they right? Are they justified to use force there? Even though the facts are against them? So more generally, the idea that you can distinguish defensive force from offensive force is pretty interesting because it suggests that there is more than one kind of force. It suggests that, hey, you can subdivide force. So why can't we subdivide offensive force and defensive force into additional categories of offensive and defensive force? Let's say that we have the category of offensive force, which is literally genociding people, and hey, maybe we're not okay with that. And then we have the category of offensive force, which is taxing people, which means taking a little bit of their time and forcing it into government projects, because that's what taxation is. You're taking people's money, which stands in for their time, and you're using it to contribute to other projects. For example, in this case, maybe healthcare. So that form of offensive force seems entirely legitimate to me because you're net improving everyone's ability to achieve things in their lives. This becomes about what goals you're trying to maximize and not about like logical consistency. Not at all. It does not follow from A equals A.
So would you say that the idea of offensive and defensive force goes against the law of contradiction? Was that one? Or...
No, I'm saying that the law of contradiction doesn't necessarily lead to any moral principles. It's like, let me put it another way. One of the things that he's trying to do here is bridge the is-ought gap. He's trying to say that logic is this, therefore we ought to do that. But this simply does not follow. If you write it down as a logical structure, there will never be any example of this person is trans method. Please, I beg of you, just be not horny for once in your life. The basic idea is that when you're saying like, hey, non-contradiction is a logical principle, non-contradiction is a principle of all epistemologies, none of this tells you that you should do something, that you shouldn't hold contradictory beliefs, you shouldn't engage in contradictory acts. There's no should in any of those. So if he wants to prove me wrong, I challenge him. He could be the first philosopher in literal history to like show a set of premises which logically are valid and are logically sound, which start from an is statement, proceed through an ought statement. So go fucking ahead.
Isn't that how you base your morality?
I mean, I would say, yeah, I mean, at some level, I think everyone does this, but just to be clear, I don't set it out as hey, I think this is proof of every principle I believe in. I'm this is highly contingent, and I'm not sure if I can prove this.
Oh, now you're saying it's highly contingent? I thought you were certain about it. Alright, you've walked back a little bit.
What? Method, when we've had these discussions about morality, I
literally have a recording of you. I literally have a recording of you.
Oh my
I will
God.
dig it. I can't play it on the stream, but I do have the recording. I saved it because it made me laugh so hard. I was rolling on the floor dying. Holy shit, let me find this.
Look, I will be the first to admit that I'm not the most well-versed on philosophical issues, but I also will say that generally I try to assert that the moral principles that I hold are contingent. They are contingent on a particular belief about I should be clear. I think there was one conversation that I had with you and Luke, which convinced me that my views were not objective. They were in fact subjective because it depended on which view of the goal of epistemology you had. So therefore, I do not bridge the is-ought gap. I only bridge it if you believe in a certain epistemology. So I do think I actually changed my mind on that one.
Okay, so it did happen, or it just happened way after the fact?
I just didn't
Also,
even remember
can you
it.
see Twitch chat?
Can I see Twitch chat? Think so, yeah. Stop trying to ban Shiny. Just you two need to make up. You literally need to make up. Just relax. Oh my God.
Alright, I'll stop for you and me.
Okay, so I'm gonna go to bed in a moment. So Antizer, you sent me this video, okay? And you wanted to leech off of me,
Yeah.
okay? You wanted my impressive 20-person stream, okay?
Yep.
So, did you have any closing
I
remarks
will-
you wanted to make about the video? Any streams you wanted to shout out or anything like that?
Shout out to my boy Sinister Politics on Twitch.tv. He makes interesting streams on news, and yeah, that's pretty much it. But it was this is an interesting video because I feel like a lot of the way you're meant to tackle it is just based on how he like sets out the argument. I find that like interesting, like how he sets it out, and how you set it out with the A and B thing, which is, I think I've seen philosophy use it before, but I'm not too educated on it.
Well, syllogisms are like, basically the way you can conceive of it is this: if you can't write your claim into a syllogism, then it's not valid. You can't actually make the claim that one thing causes another. And so, you know, if Shane wants to like prove that his thing is true, just write out a syllogism, proceed from premise 1, x equals y, and end up at the conclusion that like you start with premise 1, which is like non-contradiction bad or something along those lines, and you end up at the conclusion, which is initiation of use of force always bad. And to be clear, right, when he says non-contradiction bad as the first premise, that would actually work because that's starting with a moral premise. That's literally how I start at method. If you're familiar, I argue that there's like an epistemological good thing to do, and so therefore I never actually bridge the is-ought gap. I start after the ought. I'm already in the ought territory, but he firmly starts in the is. You need to say non-contradiction follows from the the principle of consistency follows from non-contradiction. Therefore, we arrive at an ought statement. So he can try, but
I just
so I know I did.
Oh
my
I was
god!
spamming your Twitch chat, but I don't understand how he comes to this belief. Like seriously, I think any basic philosophy person should realize how weird this is. It's like so bizarre. Like I don't know how you could like take entry level philosophy 101 and like not think this is weird. It's just so weird. Like they're almost unrelated. They're like not the non-contradiction thing and the consistency thing are almost like they're not the same thing. Like it's weird. I don't know why you think this is a weird thing to think. I don't know. It's very bizarre.
So I'm pretty sure, akin to like Darth Dawkins, right? It comes from some book they read or some stream they watched, because like the certainty with which he says it, I think indicates that he hasn't actually like researched how like the depth of philosophical arguments here. To be clear, probably neither have I, but he definitely hasn't.
How did you turn that Twitch post into a Twitter meme that quick? How did you do that?
Nordic Gamer.
Holy shit.
The hotkeys are Windows Shift S.
So let me see this. Oh, I had a screenshot. So let me see this. Can I do this? All right, let me open up Twitter and then like screen cap something. So
Nick, I swear to God, if you start talking about like what's his name, the weird like integralist that Trump appointed, I'm gonna lose my goddamn mind.
Wait, Trump appointed an integralist? Who? Oh, nice. Yeah, you did it.
Trump Vermeulen.
I see how you did it.
Adrian Vermeulen of Massachusetts. Apparently, this guy's some integralist.
So wait, does that mean Trump is actually a fascist now?
I don't know.
Wait. What do you mean now? That's a bit of a...
There was actually okay. So
Okay,
I'll offer two closing things, and then I'm probably gonna end the stream. But I will talk in Discord for a moment or two. Discord links in the description if you guys want to simp for me. So closing thoughts. One, the flaw with Shane's argument is very simple. The argument relies on the idea that all uses of force, or at least all initiations of force, are identical. This is patently absurd and falls apart upon the lightest scrutiny. One method would be show that it leads to absurdity by substituting any other word like use of force, such as use of fucking or whatever, which would mean that you could never have sex because sometimes you oppose the starting of sex with some individuals, like children or people who are like unable to consent, mentally incapacitated, and so on, right? If you substitute stop. If you substitute in other words, then the logical structure is the same, but clearly it relies on the soundness of the original premise that all of these uses are identical. So the soundness of that premise is clearly not the case. Initiations of the use of force are different, and use of force in general is different, or at least intuitively I think so. And if he wishes to argue against this, right, to argue that they are all identical, I think that burden of proof is almost certainly on him to do that one. So that's the failure of Shane Killian's argument. Also, teehee, good meme. And the second thing, I had a second thing I was going to say. It was to respond to method. There was this really neat Matt Bruenig article called Matt Bruenig Google Guy. So Matt Bruenig is like this socialist writer who you should read if you're like turning into a reformist socialist. And In it, he recounts how even though Trump is like supposed to be this era of cultural conservatism, his National Labor Relations Board appointees smashed the cultural conservative hero James Damore because they wanted to give more power to employers. They wanted to give more power to Google to smash unionization because James Damore was involved in the Google union or the attempt at forming Google unionization. So, in short, if Trump is a fascist, it's just like ye old standard libertarian fascist. The cultural conservative shit, that doesn't seem to be too important to his actual policy. It's just incidental. That's my take.
I just don't know, Bone. Have you talked to the James Damore guy? He was on Discord for like a good while.
I've never talked to him, though.
Oh, he's like really dumb. Like I don't know what's like going on. He does that ramble thing and just like rambled for like an hour and then like lied about his document. Have you seen it? It's just it's so bad.
It's pretty dumb.
It's
like,
so dumb.
I've even become somewhat convinced of the argument that there are biological differences in job preference. So I don't even necessarily disagree with the outcome, like the difference he's arguing for. But the document itself is just absurd. It's so stupid.
I found this one study and it says this one thing, and here's my graph that I made in Google
Yeah.
Charts.
It's actually amazing that someone thought that they should send this to every, like, could you imagine you work at like 1,000-person institution, like your school, and you just pinged at everyone at your school and you're like, hey, I wrote this really cute blog post. Look at my Excel charts. Like, I can't imagine the arrogance of this guy. Holy
Honestly, I would have just fired him because it's not even good, right? You could have at least, like, looked at the other sites, right? Compared their research, then made it into a document instead of just like Googling. Like, it looks like a school. It looks like a school Google slide report.
It literally does. Well, one of the other memes here is he was in California, right? Damore, California. Let me get James Damore. Yeah, so he was in California, and one of the only reasons that he was able to even try and do anything about this is because California is one of those lefty states which gives you a lot of protection for your employment. If he was in Maryland, which is I think it's at will firing. I forget the name of it, but they could have just fired him for any reason and just lied. It's right to work, and so they can just fire him for any reason. And he wouldn't have had a leg to stand on. They could have just said, yeah, we fired you because your code was bad, and just lied. He couldn't prove shit. Anyway, end of the stream there. I don't know why the stream always picks up in viewers as it gets later in time. Y'all need to get a fucking normal sleep
Mostly,
schedule.
I think right to work is a hilarious left-wing talking point because every single time a right-wing person says, oh, that person shouldn't have been fired, it's their free speech rights, well, you could just go, right to work law.
This is the guy that sent the vid? You mean Farmlard? Wait, but
Yeah, Farmlord sent
I'm pretty sure I know Farmlard in real life.
That'd be actually pretty interesting.
That's fine.
Oh my god, that's horrifying.
Imagine being anti-unions. Like, if you're anti-private sector unions, it's like really, really transparent what you actually want because they're just good. They didn't do nothing.
How? Fuck.
I mean, I could see you being against like union lobbying, but like just unions like negotiating with the business is just gonna be good. Oh, comments. So I want to talk to you about a foreign policy thing, but I don't want it on stream. So.
Okay, well, I'm going to bed, so you can talk to me tomorrow.
Yeah, I don't want it on record.
Yeah, my foreign policy is. I don't even want to know what that could be about. God damn it.
Your foreign policy is just.
I just want to talk to you about this thing that would get around the Geneva Conventions, and I wanted your opinion on it.
What, just like form a paramilitary that you accidentally let chemical weapons fall into the hands of?
Yeah, that's actually what it is.
Oh my god.
Your foreign policy.
That's
like,
part of
make
it.
so you
Basically,
don't
what it
get
is
foreign
like you
policy
create
later.
like a non-profit. Wait, you're still streaming. I'm gonna be quiet right now. Yo, hey, let me be very clear to the people that watch Comments Way stream. This is purely hypothetical. This is not an actual idea. I am not advocating for this. I'm just running it by the think tank. Okay. Everything I say on the stream is like 95% a meme. Okay.
One of the things that I think is very interesting in libertarian philosophy is this idea of force as only that which involves violence. So, like, this meme summarizes it up pretty succinctly, right? So you've got ANCAP ball, taxation is slavery, the evil government takes a portion of your income, they own your labor. And then Sockdemball says, no, taxation is not slavery. Collecting taxes doesn't force you to work, and you can choose to avoid taxes by not working. And then NCAPball, of course, says, how is that an option? People don't have a choice for work. They need money for food and shelter.
Could you show me where the United States government has violated the Geneva Conventions?
Oh my God. Please, I beg of you, don't debate method on foreign policy. It'll just turn into fucking shitfest. The basic point is that the idea of force, right, of basically, if you don't want to be taxed, simply choose not to work. Okay, well, NCAPs will say, if you don't want to be forced to work, you can simply choose not to. If you don't want to be forced to go into job XYZ, you can simply choose a different profession. But this clearly is not the actual case of most people in real life. And I also really liked, there's a bit of a summary. There's a bit of a summary of that portion of Marx's argument in this paper about class structure, which I guess maybe I can link in the description or something. But the basic argument is workers are those, in this article they argue, workers are those who don't have sufficient capital that if they didn't work, they could subside off of it. So long as we live in a society where most people could not live off of the profits of their capital, then most people will be forced to work. Which I think is a very interesting argument because it doesn't follow from Marxist class presuppositions of ownership. It literally just follows from what you need to sustain yourself. And with that, I'm going to end the stream. Glad that you've all been lefty-pilled. Shane Killian, dumb as usual, but I would love to have a debate.
Could you show me a single case of the United States violating the Geneva Conventions?